Governor's debate. Now a debate between the candidates for Vermont's one congressional seat. Seeking re-election is independent Bernie Sanders. His challenger is a Republican, Mark Candon. The debate's a half hour and took place last Saturday.
First time you're going to hear from Bernie Sanders and Mark Candon together. They are here live in our studios with us tonight, and we appreciate them being here. We are running two debates. We are broadcasting two debates here at Channel 3, this one for Congress tonight, and then tomorrow night at about 6:15 we will have the debate by the two leading candidates for governor, Ruth Dwyer and Howard Dean. We asked for your questions. We got some interesting responses. We appreciate all of those people who wrote us with questions for the candidates. We will be using them in tonight's program. We've also researched some of the questions and the issues through a nonpartisan group called Project Vote Smart, which examines issues in almost every election. It provides facts and background information for reporters and the public in the interest of informing the electorate, and that is our interest as well. A coin toss here at Channel 3 just a few minutes ago. It was determined that Mr. Sanders would begin with the opening statement, and he also was going to get the final word. So I guess the best thing to do is start. The candidates are each going to get a 2-minute opening statement, and then we will have the questions. Mr. Sanders.
Thank you, Masilis. Let me begin by thanking the people of Vermont for the honor of having allowed me to represent them in the Congress for the last 8 years and for doing what no other state in the United States has done in modern history, and that is send an independent to Washington, somebody outside of the two-party system. And I thank the people of Vermont very much for that honor. Let me, in the very limited time that I have, talk about some of the areas where I focused my attention and some of the accomplishments that we've made. At a time when the scourge of cancer is striking millions of American families, I am proud to be the author of the National Cancer Registry Act, which cancer researchers believe is playing a vital role in providing information as to who is being afflicted with cancer, what kind of work they do, what kind of environment they live in, and most importantly, how effective the treatment that they're receiving is. And that's an issue that I'm very proud of having worked on. Most Vermonters know that I have worked over the years as hard as I could to represent the interest of working Vermonters. And in that capacity, I helped lead the fight to raise the minimum wage from a paltry $4.25 an hour to $5.15 an hour. We've got to go higher, and if reelected, I will fight to make sure that anyone in this country who works 40 hours a week does not live in poverty. In addition, I am proud to be the author of perhaps the major piece of legislation dealing with child labor that was passed in the last couple of years, and that will prohibit the importation of any product into this country made by children who are indentured servants, and there are millions of those kids in the desperate third world countries. In Congress, I have led the effort against the Department of Defense and the VA for failing to provide adequate treatment for our Gulf War veterans who are suffering from Gulf War illness, and I am proud to say that in the near future there will finally be real treatment, effective treatment for those 100,000 people who are hurting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. An opening statement now of 2 minutes from Mark Candon, Republican
Thank you, Marcellus.
candidate.
This campaign for Congress places Vermont values and the heritage of this state on trial. And the critical issue defining these values and deciding whether the philosophy of Bernie Sanders or that of Mark Candon best serves the long-term interests of this state. I believe Vermont is about hope and opportunity, families, self-reliance, enterprise, and thrift. Do we want the tiresome rhetoric of our current congressman, or do we want the hopeful consensus-making, which I think befits the heritage of this state and the tradition of George Aiken? Living in Vermont has never been easy, but it has always been worth it. And I believe Mr. Sanders wants to kill the golden goose and sow the seeds of envy and class warfare. His agenda is big government, one-size-fits-all health care, and the redistribution of wealth of which he has never, ever created one nickel. I believe in the can-do system. I believe in the can-do attitude. I want to simplify your taxes. I want to simplify and save Social Security. I want to promote good family values and provide a strong defense for our country and good jobs for our workers. I think Vermonters currently have no representation in the halls of the U.S. Congress. And this campaign is about fixing this state of affairs, turning a page of history, and sending a true Vermont voice to the halls of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Candon. With that, we're going to embark on a series of questions, 8 questions, one for each candidate. We have selected these, as I said, from some of the questions that you have sent in, our viewers and our listeners. We appreciate that. We told the candidates initially when we set up this debate that we would ask the incumbent the first question, so here we go. It's the economy. It is a question from Sue Morris from Southern Vermont, who sent it in by email. Mr. Sanders, we've had years of budget deficits, no balanced budget since all 3 of us were children in high school years ago. But now, for the first time in 3 or 4 decades, we may well have a surplus. One of the questions that you may have to face is, how do we deal with that surplus? Should we reduce the deficit, reduce taxes, increase entitlement programs, or raise defense spending? How do we deal with the surplus? 90 seconds to answer, and then a 30-second response from Mr. Candon.
First of all, we have to acknowledge that that so-called surplus is really a Social Security surplus. This year, the Social Security Trust Fund has a $100 billion surplus. General government is actually running in deficit. So I believe very strongly that you do not dip into the Social Security Trust Fund in order to give tax breaks to anybody. Now, do I believe that we should change our priorities in this country and help the middle class and working families with tax breaks? I sure do. And the way you do that is to do away with the huge tax breaks we've given billionaires, the $125 billion a year we've spent on corporate welfare, the excessive military spending that is currently going on right now. So I think we can afford tax breaks, but they must not come out of the Social Security Trust Fund. Furthermore, I believe that in terms of the economy, it's important to raise the minimum wage. Anybody who works 40 hours a week should not live in poverty, and we have got to change our absolutely failing trade policy. This year, we're going to be running up a $200 billion trade deficit, which equates to the loss of millions of decent-paying jobs. And that's why I oppose NAFTA. That's why I oppose most favored nation status with China. Our economy right now is low in unemployment. It's low in inflation. There are a lot of good things. But one thing that we should be cognizant of, the average Vermonter today is working longer hours for lower wages than was the case 20 years ago. What we have got to do is make the economy work for the middle class and working families, not just for the people on top.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. A response, 30 seconds. Mr. Candon.
This economy is the strongest economy in the history of the world because of free market principles, which my opponent has fought for years, for 30 years in the state of Vermont. I would give 90% to Social Security, and I would move Social Security off budget all by itself, which is something we should have done 30 years ago. We never should have combined them. And I would give the other 10% back to the taxpayers to keep the economy stoked and keep this world on the course it's headed.
Thank you, Mr. Candon. We are going to get later to Social Security more specifically, but let's again ask a question about federal spending. The federal government spends billions of dollars on a variety of programs. This question for you, Mr. Candon, what single program or group of programs is the most important? And if there is a budget surplus, how would you pay for it? How much would you pay for it? And what other programs might suffer? 90 seconds.
I don't believe that we really have to cut a lot. I think if we can keep this economy going, that we don't. I would say Social Security is probably maybe one of the major programs. And I also think a strong defense is very important, and I would increase defense spending. But the fact of the matter is, this American economy has been driving the engine ever since they cut tax rates back in 1981. And what I think we can do is if we can simplify the tax code and cut the tax rates and let people keep more of what they earn and drive the American economy, that not only will we continue this growth that we've seen in the last 17 or 18 years, but we can pay for all the government programs. That's not enough, though. we have to look to make sure that the dollars that the federal government gets goes to where they do the most good. And where they do the most good is closest to home. I think we have too much government. Government has been growing 8% a year for 45 years, and the economy has been growing 3 or 4% a year. So I think there are some savings that we can make, but I say if we can simplify the tax code and keep the economy going and keep the American people working like they are right now, that we can increase and improve our economy and have the revenues that government needs.
Thanks, Mr. Candon. Mr. Sanders, a 30-second response.
Social Security has been the most successful anti-poverty program in world history. It must be protected and expanded for our children and our grandchildren. It was an outrage last year that Congress cut Medicare by $115 billion in order to give tax breaks to the very richest people in this country. The United States is the only nation on earth that does not have a national health care system guaranteeing health care to all people. So therefore, we've got to make sure that the 43 million Americans who have no health insurance do have health insurance. Millions of families can't afford to send their kids to college. Cut Star Wars, adequately fund education.
You've both touched on the issue that is raised in our second question. It's a question that we got from a number of viewers here at Channel 3. A number of Vermonters here are elderly. A number of them are concerned about the prospects for the future of both Medicare and Social Security. Mr. Sanders, you've said there's no real crisis in Social Security, and yet the number of workers supporting the beneficiaries is declining sharply. It was 16 to 1 back in the 1950s. It's now about 3 to 1, and it's still going down. Many people and some economists think that Social Security could go bankrupt in the early part of the next century, perhaps in our lifetimes. Even the president established a special advisory commission. What changes need to be made to Social Security and Medicare to ensure that the benefits will be available for us and for our children?
Okay. Let's put that question into a context of what's going on in our society today. Mr. Candon says that the economy is really booming, doing well. It's wrong. The average worker today is working longer hours for low wages than was the case 20 years ago. The richest one person in America has more wealth than the bottom 100 million Americans. So the economy is working really well for the people on top, not for the middle class, not for the working families. That's where we have to focus our attention. In terms of Social Security, there is no dispute about the facts, none whatsoever. Social Security today will have has this year a $100 billion surplus, over $500 billion in the trust fund. If the United States Congress does absolutely nothing, and I think we should do something, Social Security will be able to pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 34 years. Is there a problem? Yes, and you described what the problem is. Does that mean there's a crisis? Does that mean today we've got to privatize Social Security, tomorrow? Absolutely not. Now, what are some of the things that we should do to strengthen Social Security for our kids and our grandchildren to make sure that this program, which has never on one occasion missed one payment to one eligible American in over 50 years, is preserved? A couple of things. First of all, you don't raid the Social Security Trust Fund to give tax breaks to anybody. You preserve that. Number two, right now, somebody who is making $68,000 a year pays exactly the same amount into the trust fund as somebody who's making $10 million a year. That's wrong. If you lift the ceiling, if you say to the people on top, you're going to have to contribute more, Social Security will be strong and viable for decades after the 34 years it will currently be safe.
Mr. Candon, a response.
Social Security's own numbers say they cannot pay 75% of the benefits 30 years down the road. And Mr. Sanders wants to do something about it, but he joined 7 other representatives in a 413 to 8 vote to not even look at the Social Security issue. We should keep it exactly the way it is for the elderly. But for younger workers that are paying 12.4% of their payroll into a Social Security system that's going to return them 1 or 2 or 3%, we should look to privatizing, like Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan believes.
Well, that question deserves the follow-up, and it is, in fact, the one we're going to ask. You have said, Mr. Candon, privatize portions of Social Security. Even the Presidential Commission, which you just referred to, could not reach a consensus. There were 3 sort of minority reports. Why should we put money at risk that so many people critically depend on? With the Asian crisis and the volatility of the market these days, isn't it really a greater risk to put our retirement money into the stock market rather than the dependable return we're getting now?
Let me start by saying this, Marcellus. Currently, there's $660 billion in the Social Security Trust Fund invested in U.S. Treasuries. We have interest rates the lowest that they've been in 20 or 30 years. If we had interest rates go from 4.5% where they are today to 8%, the buying power of that $660 billion would be cut significantly. We have risk today. We have risk today in our Social Security Trust Fund. Okay, but for Social Security, for younger workers, this is a win-win-win. If they can take a portion, not all, 25, 35% of their payroll taxes and put them into a private account that belongs to them forever, future Congresses can't get their hands on that money. And if they die before they get to collect the benefits, their beneficiaries get that money to use the way their children may want, to buy a new home. That's a great improvement for the Social Security system. It will also strengthen over time the Social Security system because the returns will be much greater than the return Uncle Sam promises to give. It will not be enough. Lastly, it will be good for the American economy because it will also stoke small companies to become big companies. It's good for the American economy, and then finally it'll get the little guy for the first time to be able to invest and try to live the American dream. So the little guy can do what the big guy's been always able to do. Mr. Sanders has the ability in his retirement account to invest in the markets.
Mr. Sanders, a 30-second response.
Mr. Candon told the people of the state of Vermont in an op-ed, and I quote, privatizing has worked unbelievably well in Chile, end of quote. That's the model that he looked at. They have privatized. Yet this year, the Undersecretary for Social Security told the people of Chile under their wonderful plan, he said, you know what? Gee, the stock market is going way down in Chile. We just don't have quite enough money right now. Postpone your retirement. Function of Social Security is to provide security. I don't want to go back to the 20s and the 30s when old people did not have enough to eat and were sleeping out on the street. Social Security needs changes, but not risky and radical ideas like those advocated by Mr. Candon.
With that, we need to move on to a different issue that you would deal with, no matter which of you is elected to Congress, and that is the issue of foreign policy. President John Kennedy once said that domestic policy can hurt you, but foreign policy can kill you. Mr. and Mrs. Morris from Rutland wrote us about defense issues, and we've taken the liberty of taking a number of questions on this issue and molding them into a couple. Let's begin with you, Mr. Sanders. We see increased instability in this world. North Korea is rebuilding its nuclear capacity. They're firing missiles over Japan. India and Pakistan have detonated nuclear weapons. There's still talk of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The Mideast is far from stable. Our actual spending in terms of $1997 is stable. You've said reduce defense spending, and yet now it is at the lowest point that it has been since before Pearl Harbor, 2% of gross domestic product. Isn't it time to rebuild?
We have got to take a hard look at national priorities. In the United States today, we have millions of senior citizens who cannot afford their prescription drugs, families that cannot afford to send their kids to college. Now, the difference between now and 10 years ago or 20 years ago is that the Soviet Union is no longer a superpower. It does not exist. Communism is virtually dead. Is the world a safe place? No, it is not. And you've indicated some of the areas where the world is unsafe and where the United States must be active in making sure that we have the strongest defense on earth. But let me tell you something. Right now, we're spending over $270 billion a year on the military. We spend $100 billion a year defending Europe and Asia. We are spending billions of dollars on defense systems and weapons systems that the Pentagon tells us they don't even need. The Intelligence Department lost $4 billion. They couldn't even find it. So I think that the Defense Department and the intelligence agencies have got to shape up and become a lot meaner and leaner than is the case right now, if they're going to do the job that we are asking them to do. So my view is that in Europe, for example, we were dealing with Bosnia. The Europeans must play a more active role. I don't think we need to spend $100 billion defending Europe and Asia. I think we have got to tell those people who are pushing pork into the Defense Department that Mr. Gingrich and Mr. Lott cannot have the ships and the planes in their district. And I think we have got to move forward on that. So I believe that the United States should have the strongest defense on earth. I think the Defense Department has got to do a better job prioritizing its needs.
Mr. Candon, 30-second response.
Thank you. We have received the peace dividend, and it came from the defense spending that we had in the 1980s. And we won the Cold War. Before that, we won World War I and we won World War II. And America must take the lead in world defense. It's for world freedom and it's for free trade. Mr. Sanders wants to cut defense and has always voted to cut defense. He introduced a bill to cut the intelligence budget, our only defense of terrorism. He voted against our military fighting in the Gulf. Being prepared for war is the most effectual means of preserving the peace.
Mr. Candon, a similar defense question for you. On the very first interview that you gave on this television station after announcing your candidacy, you advocated resuming the Star Wars research program. National security experts say we are at much greater risk from a terrorist with a suitcase than we are from a missile from Moscow. Star Wars has been roundly criticized as a welfare program for weapons contractors that really did not physically increase our national security. Why put our money into that kind of an effort?
Okay, I just want to say this once, that the only Star Wars program that I'm looking forward to seeing is the one that George Lucas is producing. It's another one of his movies. But listen, we have to face the fact that this is a very dangerous world, a very dangerous world. Right now, Korea, a couple of weeks ago, lobbed a missile over Japan. And I think, I've looked at this since we talked, Marcellus, and for a start, why can't we spend $5 billion in the next 3 or 4 years and outfit the Aegis-class ships that are already on the high seas with several hundred anti-ballistic missiles? I think we can do it, and I think we should do it, because 75% of the American people believe we have a ballistic missile defense, and the fact of the matter is we have no ballistic missile defense. And I do not want to be the congressman who 4 or 5 or 10 years from now has to stand up and say that we lost an American city and we could have done something about it back in 1999.
Mr. Sanders, 30
I think
seconds.
almost every expert recognizes that Star Wars is a multi-zillion-dollar boondoggle. It is not worth the kinds of money, the tens of billions of dollars that some people want to put into it. Let's get our priorities right. You indicated that terrorism is a major problem, and I agree with you. We've got to do a better job with intelligence and not put money into B-2 bombers or into Star Wars programs. Also, remember, when you put money into Star Wars, you're telling those people, older people who don't have prescription drugs, we don't have enough money for you. Those families who can't afford education, we don't have enough money for you, but we do have enough money for Star Wars. I don't think so.
With that, we've come to the end of the sort of the formal 6 questions, and we want to ask you to ask each other questions. And I'm going to give the opportunity for Mr. Sanders to begin and ask Mr. Candon a question.
Mr. Candon, it is generally regarded that Newt Gingrich and his friends are running the most right-wing reactionary Congress in the modern history of the United States of America. You have made it clear that you would vote for Mr. Gingrich for Speaker, which means that that type of ideology will be the prevalent ideology in the United States Congress. Why would you support such a right-wing extremist as Mr. Gingrich?
Well, I'd just like to say this, that it looks to me like the Republican Revolution, which took place in this country 4 years ago, has done a very good job, because we have now balanced the first budget in 29 years. And this all took place on Mr. Sanders' watch. And, you know, I just came back from Washington, and there's Republican congressmen in Washington that don't know how to pronounce Mr. Sanders' last name. This is how far away he is from where the power is in the Congress of the United States. Now, you know, I think I can work with the Republican majority. I'm a Vermonter. I come from bipartisan roots. I have a history of consensus making in my 4 years in the Vermont legislature. And I'm happy to work with anyone. And you know what? I think I can bring them around to the Vermont point of view. And I'm going to be in a much better position than our current congressman to do so.
Well, you've only used a minute of your time. I'll give you about an equal amount of opportunity to question Mr. Sanders. You have one question for Mr. Sanders?
Yes, I do.
We're going to give him about a minute and 10 seconds to respond.
Here in Vermont, we have watched job after job and industry after industry leave because of an anti-business environment an environment you have championed. I think you love chaos and encourage class warfare. Can you name, right now, one private sector job that you are directly responsible for bringing to Vermont in the 8 years that you have been in Congress?
First of all, Mr. Candon, I'm not the governor of the state of Vermont. You're a little bit confused. I'm the United States Congressman. And I am very happy to have helped bring in money to the city of Burlington and other communities around the state which are being used for economic development. But second of all, when you talk about the fact that jobs are leaving the state of Vermont, you just told us a few minutes ago that the economy is booming. And now you're telling us that the economy in the state of Vermont is not doing well for middle class and working families, and you're absolutely right. But I'll tell you why the economy is not doing well for middle class families and the role that I've helped play in Congress. At least I fought to raise the minimum wage against your friend, Mr. Gingrich, so that people now have at least a minimum standard of living. I have fought against our disastrous trade policies. You don't want to know why jobs are leaving? They're not just leaving the state of Vermont. They're leaving the United States of America. We have a $200 billion trade deficit. If you go to a department store, you know where the products are manufactured? They're manufactured in China by American corporations that are paying workers there 20 cents an hour. And they're manufactured in Indonesia. They're manufactured in Mexico. Our current trade policy is a disaster. It has cost us millions of jobs, and I've led the effort against that, and I'm proud of it.
I'm going to ask just one other quick question here because we need to leave 2 minutes for each candidate to make a closing statement. We wrote down a half-dozen quick questions that we could ask you, and I'm going to ask you both to answer this in about 15 or 20 seconds. I have a question for each of you. Some years ago, the federal government made the states raise the drinking age to 21 or face the prospect of losing federal highway money. This year, we lead the nation in teenage drunk driving deaths. With that as an introduction, for you, Mr. Sanders, when we ended prohibition, we said liquor control is a state issue. Shouldn't it be a state issue and not subject to this kind of federal blackmail?
I think the federal government has a role, but I think it's primarily a state issue. And I think the question that we have to ask, and I know that it's being experienced right here in the city of Burlington, is why so many kids are doing so much drinking. What's going on? Why would kids want to get drunk out of their minds?
So you would repeal this federal...
I, as it happens, when I was mayor of the city of Burlington, opposed the raising of the age to 21 because I thought that was discriminatory against young people. But I think drunken driving, for example, is a terribly serious problem. I think we need vigorous law enforcement on that, primarily at the statewide level, but I would not absolve the federal government from playing a role in that area.
Mr. Candon, some people watching tonight can vote for you in this country, but they have to go to Canada to get a legal drink. Would you lower the drinking age?
I would not. But as to your first question, I would leave most of those questions to the individual states, to the states, not the federal government, on this issue.
Okay. Thank you both. Mr. Candon, with that, you have 2 minutes for a closing statement, and you will be followed, obviously, by Mr. Sanders.
Folks, I look forward to fleshing out these differences that we have, and it's very difficult to do so in the time that we have allotted tonight. And I look forward to getting into more depth to discuss these issues in depth with Mr. Sanders as this campaign progresses. Vermont is a wonderful place, but it is fast becoming what it is perceived to be beyond our borders. Were they having a good economy? Because beyond our borders, Vermont is perceived to be a tax and spend, suffocatingly regulatory state with a lousy business climate. I think our congressman sets that tone. And it will only get worse if we continue to send him to Washington. This election is about the future of this state and the future of this nation. Do we want the land of the free and the home of the brave, or do we want big government and class warfare? Do we want jobs for our workers, or do we want dependence on the almighty state? Mr. Sanders has had his chance. He's had 8 years to push his radical agenda. And in those 8 years, America and Congress have moved further and further and further away from him. He is the voice of the past, and I am the voice of the future. He only criticizes. He never offers solutions. I do. Mr. Sanders is a walking billboard for the hard left. I grew up in Vermont. We hate billboards. Vermont needs a new voice and a new direction. It is time to turn the page of history and embrace the future, not hide from it. I trust the good citizens of this state to decide what is best. Together, we can restore Vermont to what it used to represent, the American home of freedom and unity, and I pledge to commit my life and my sacred honor if I can get the privilege of serving as your congressman.
Mr. Sanders, a little over 2 minutes.
Let me thank the 170,000 members of Vermont's credit unions for the support that they are giving me and for the award that they gave me for helping them preserve their right to stay in their credit unions. Let me thank all of the environmental groups in the state of Vermont who are endorsing my candidacy. Let me thank all the senior citizen groups who are supporting my candidacy, and all of them are. And let me thank all of the working people in the labor organizations that are supporting my candidacies, and they are as well. The differences between Mr. Candon and me are profound. I think people have just heard that. I am pro-choice. I do not believe the government of the United States and Mr. Gingrich should be telling women what they can do on some of the most personal matters that they can experience. I would not raid the Social Security Trust Fund. Mr. Candon would. I would not use taxpayer money for vouchers for private schools. In fact, I would change our priorities so that we put more money into public education. And not only do we have higher quality public schools, but we make sure that every kid in this country, regardless of his or her income, has the right to get a college education. Mr. Candon, as you heard, wants to spend tens of billions of dollars more on Star Wars. I want to make sure that the elderly people in this country get the prescription drugs that they need, don't have to cut their dosages in half. I have a vision, and that is that this great country can make certain that every man, woman, and child has a decent standard of living, health care for all, educational opportunity for all, and environmental sanity so that we leave this planet in better shape than it is right now. I've been very proud to represent Vermont for 8 years and would very much appreciate the support of Vermonters in this election.
With that, thank you both. I want to also thank people for watching. Thank you for sending in your questions. We are going to be asking the candidates some of those questions in the days ahead. There are only 17 days left until Election Day. We would urge you to consider the candidates, consider your vote. Stay tuned to Channel 3 for examination of those issues, and obviously, we all can agree that you ought to be out and vote on November 3rd. I'm Marcellus Parsons. Thanks for watching. Join us again tomorrow for another Debate 98.